Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Coping with COVID-19 webinar. I am Jamie Dumas, and I'm the Communications Manager here at WellcomeMD. During our program tonight, Dr. Neil Carl, Dr. Mary Colfer, and Dr. John Woodward will each share their firsthand accounts of contracting the virus. Before we kick things off, though, I would like to share a little background information on each of them. Dr. Neil Carl joins us from our Richmond office. Dr. Carl is board certified in family medicine and anti-aging and regenerative medicine. He has a passion for helping patients maintain or regain optimal vitality and wellness as they age. Dr. Mary Colfer is also joining us from our Richmond office. Dr. Colfer is board certified in emergency medicine and anti-aging and regenerative medicine. She works with her patients to develop safe, individualized treatment plans based on the latest scientific breakthroughs. And Dr. John Woodward is joining us from our Charlotte and Mooresville offices. Dr. Woodward is board certified in family medicine, anti-aging, and integrative and holistic medicine. He uses an integrative approach by merging conventional medicine and evidence-based functional medicine treatments. We will be taking questions this evening, so please feel free to submit those via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So if you just look at your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A option. Submit those at any point, and we will answer them at the end of the program. If you do have a question for a specific physician, please make sure to note that in your submission. Otherwise, whichever physician feels like they are best apt to answer that question, we'll go ahead and answer that question. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Dr. Woodward to get us started this evening.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Today we're going to talk a little bit about just our experiences with COVID initially, but I wanted to just kind of start it off with a little something different as to how does WellcomeMD recommend things different from the conventional world. We all know there's vaccines and the data is developing and we've got some good evidence for recommending some of those vaccines. However, how would we be different than somebody else? And something that I've done, and I've done a series of webinars before I was with Wellcome, as to what should we be focusing on during this pandemic. And the good news, I think, that most of us try to instill and teach with our patients is, how do we support your immune system to handle a pandemic like this or any other insult to your immune system? And we really are focusing on lifestyle medicine and foundational pieces of wellness medicine. So before I started that off, I just thought, hopefully any of the people that I've helped through this pandemic or through this illness, including myself, which I'll share with you in a minute, we talk about sleep and stress and exercise and nutrition and a number of other things that might impact that. So the biggest thing we can really do is emphasize the lifestyle piece of this, in my opinion. And I'm sure we all share that, but it's usually the discussions don't always start there, but we try to steer you in that direction to try to set your body up for success, not only so you'll receive the vaccine well, or so that you'll be able to handle a concern with the infection, but so you'll be able to make it through the infection a little bit more seamless. I at least wish that was the case for me, but I'll share that with you now as to how mine started. But we'll talk about some supplemental recommendations if you had any questions about that and some other things. But I just really want to emphasize, some people start with, when can I get the vaccine? And I believe the first question should always be, how are you managing your immune system? And so there was and the reason why I bring that up, and I'm sorry to take a little extra time to introduce this way, but there was a study with medical students. And with the medical students, they were looking at those that were stressed and not slept in a period of time, and their nutrition was poor, and they were inoculating them with the flu vaccine. Do you guys know this study by any chance? Mary or yeah. And so, what they found was that those that were cramming for the exam and they didn't sleep well and they were struggling with their lifestyle pieces because of the rigors of med school, they gave those folks the inoculation, and then they chose a control group where they were just in their kind of daily routine of med school. And what they found was that those people that were stressed, their lifestyles were really compromised to an extent, were not able to mount an immune response after the vaccine, because their bodies were not set up to receive it appropriately. And they weren't set up for success in terms of fighting illness or even using that information from the vaccine or the infection so you can have some hopefully all three of us can have some long-term immunity from the infection that we had. So there's ways to nurture that information. So I wanted to just kind of give you that study and say, look, no matter how, if you had it, you didn't have it, we want to keep you as strong as possible. So since I had to start off, you guys, I had to start with that little study. So I think that's important to take with you. But let me tell you about my experience. My experience was the day before Christmas. It was actually a few days before the Christmas holiday. In fact, Dr. Carl was down covering the clinic for me when I was with my family. And I started to have some fatigue symptoms while we were on vacation. And we just stayed in the Charlotte area. But I started to get a little bit of a headache that lasted for a couple days. I started clearing my throat a little bit more, and then had just a little tickle in my throat, just a little bit of a cough, not too bad. But the fatigue, while we were on vacation, I thought, I looked at my wife and I said, I'm ready for bed. It's 8 o'clock, but I'm ready for bed, which is only about an hour early for me, or 1 to 2 hours early. But so the fatigue really mounted fast for me, and that was really the prominent symptom. And then the cough developed. In fact, I came back and took a rapid COVID test, and it was negative. And just because I thought, well, if I'm going to be seeing people in a few days, then I need to take this test. And it was negative, but by that evening, Christmas Eve, I had full-blown body aches and chills and excessive fatigue, to the point where I went upstairs into a separate bedroom and quarantined myself at that time, put on a mask when I was around the family, and came down Christmas morning and in a mask and said, I need to go back to the clinic and retest myself. This doesn't seem right. And so sure enough, the rapid test was positive Christmas morning. And then from there, I just kind of nurtured my health and did a lot of the lifestyle recommendations that we recommend in terms of supplemental nutrition, among other things. But I'll tell you that by Sunday, Christmas was on Friday, by Sunday, I already had some significant fatigue, and I lost my taste and smell. I started to brush my teeth and couldn't taste the toothpaste. And then that just continued up to the point for about 8 days. I probably was sleeping minimum of 16 hours, maybe 18 hours a day. You'd wake up, I'd walk downstairs, and just walking back up the stairs seemed like quite a journey, and I was fatigued enough, I just wanted to collapse into the bed again. And slowly after about that week, symptoms did abate. The cough was a little bit worse, but I never had shortness of breath. I had a little tightness in my chest. However, nothing to where I was ever having respiratory distress symptoms, where I thought I was going to need to go to the hospital. The fatigue was alarming, though. I have a whole new appreciation for the level of fatigue that this illness can bring on. Just having a 2-minute conversation seemed like a lot to process. So that was mostly my symptoms, and I thought I need to get up, I need to get going. And after about 8 or 9 days, I actually tried to come to the clinic to do some work when it was closed. And by the time I got to the clinic, I had to turn around and go back home. I underestimated this little window where I felt better for about an hour or two, and I quickly had to remind myself I needed more rest. So most of my symptoms were fatigue and the headache and most of those symptoms. And some of the things I did for that were in our newsletter that we handed out, that I took the Quercetin and the vitamin D, the vitamin C, the vitamin A, and those were the kind of my staples that I took. A little glutathione as well, and we can tell you what that is if you don't know. But most of those were the things that I did, and slowly pulled through it. But it definitely took a while to get over it. But I would say a whole new appreciation for this illness. I thought I was taking fairly good care of myself, but I'll be honest with you, I probably stress too much and don't get enough good quality sleep. So that was a sign to me that, okay, after this, I need to pay more attention to my sleep and stress levels. And so, heaven forbid, a mutant strain comes and invites itself in my body. How am I going to deal with that? And so, from there, I think I'll just hand it off and see what your experience was. But I will tell you that I felt it took a good 3 weeks for me to feel human again and feel like I can actually re-engage at a meaningful level in the office. So I'll pass this on here before I take too much more time up.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Woodward. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. This is really nice to have this opportunity to talk with the patients. We thank you for your concern for us. But hopefully this will help you to know some of the symptoms that maybe aren't typical, like fever. And also I encourage people, if you do have a positive test, to be sure and let us know at the office, because we may have recommendations to help you get through it. I've had a couple people that had positives that were pretty young and healthy and didn't let us know. And I just would like to make sure you're on the right supplements and any other treatments that we think you might need. So, but having said that, my first symptoms developed on New Year's Day. Looking back, I had a little bit of congestion and just didn't feel exactly right. But I think, especially in Richmond, where we have terrible allergies, everybody has felt this, I don't know, once every 3 weeks, and you think, oh my gosh, is it COVID? And then you feel better the next morning, or you take a Zyrtec and you feel better. And so I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. I didn't have any known exposures. And so when I woke up the next day, so that was New Year's Day on Friday. On Saturday, I woke up, I felt fine. I did a really intense workout, which I regretted Saturday night. And Saturday night, I developed headache, fever, and severe body aches. My temperature wasn't very high. It was only right around 100 or 99.9, but the body aches were intense for me. And they were worse at night. And that lasted for several days for me, these severe body aches. It was all the muscles of my back in areas that don't usually hurt when I work out. And severe leg pain, and it almost felt like my bones hurt. So just a lot of pain for me. So Sunday, I woke up and went into the office, similar to Dr. Woodward, and did a rapid test on myself, which came back negative. However, I was really suspicious, and I thought, well, gosh, do I have the flu? And I went and did a rapid flu test in the other room, and that also came back negative. And I thought, well, I guess it could be something else viral. It didn't really make sense. I know that the rapid COVID test can have false negatives. So I went home, same with him. I wore a mask when I was not in my room, but pretty much stayed in my room. And that during the day, I really didn't feel that bad. I just kind of felt like I was coming down with something, but in the evenings I would have the body aches. Well, then on Monday, I found that my nurse had tested positive. So I knew that I needed to go back in and do the PCR test, which did end up, of course, coming back positive. And I just assumed I was going to be positive at that point based on my symptoms. I did have a little bit of GI symptoms from the beginning, which some people have. An interesting thing that I developed as the week went on, my body aches got better, but I started having some trouble with finding the right word at times. So this kind of word searching, which I don't usually have an issue with, forgetting to tell my family important details, like I passed my boards, which is a once every 10-year huge test. And I had been waiting for the results. My results came and I forgot to tell my husband that I passed. So that was bizarre. And I didn't have as much fatigue, I think, as Dr. Woodward and Dr. Carl. I was definitely going to bed an hour earlier than normal. I was trying to make myself rest because I thought that was important, but I wasn't having the profound fatigue. Weirdly, about a week into my symptoms, I developed nasal congestion. Like I felt like I had a cold, and I lost my sense of smell, but not taste. I was doing the same thing as Dr. Woodward, taking all the supplements that we recommend. I was taking NAC instead of glutathione, but NAC gets converted to glutathione, so that's brain protective, and we can answer questions about that later, like he mentioned. But also vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, fish oil, because I felt like my brain was being affected. I wanted that anti-inflammatory effect. I was also taking a baby aspirin for that anti-inflammatory brain effect. But I was shocked. I would have a day where I felt better, and then I would get some kind of new symptom like the loss of smell. So Dr. Carl and I had it at the same time. So we were talking to each other on the phone every day. And one of the things, and I do think maybe Dr. Woodward took this too, is the Ivermectin, which is an anti-parasitic drug that was found in South America to maybe have some benefit with COVID. And it's not totally understood if it's an antiviral or an anti-inflammatory effect that it has. But there is a little bit of data linked, especially to the loss of sense of smell, that it may help with that piece of it and may help you not develop as severe symptoms. So I went ahead and got started on that. Interestingly, the day I had lost my sense of smell was Friday. I took the ivermectin for the first time on Sunday, and on Monday I got my sense of smell right back. So I don't know if that's, that's an N of one. It's not science, but that's interesting. Maybe I was going to get it back anyway. But in retrospect, I'm glad I took it. So I did have just the tiniest little bit of dry cough. I did not have a lot of respiratory symptoms with mine, thank goodness. The cough did persist to the point that I felt I had to retest before I went back into the office, because even at 14 days, I was still having that little bit of dry cough, and I wasn't comfortable seeing patients again until I tested negative. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. The one thing I would want to mention that weren't symptoms for me, I've had a few strange symptoms in patients that I would just like to make people aware of. I've had a couple of patients that have had the COVID toes, it's called. It's a vasculitis related to having COVID, and it almost looks similar to frostbite. One patient had it all over her legs, and another just on her toes. And there are these purplish lesions that the small blood vessels are actually inflamed and leaking. So you get, it looks worse than a bruise, and it is uncomfortable. So aspirin may help prevent that. We don't know. But that is something that can be a red flag. Both of my patients that had that didn't have a lot of other symptoms. And then I had a patient that from the brain inflammation had a serious mental health crisis and has no history of that. And if you look at some of the data that they're looking at with the brain effects, that is something that's been reported all over the world. That's besides being life-threateningly ill from the respiratory symptoms, that's one of the most frightening things I've seen someone have to go through. And I think that would be something to pay attention to in younger people. We're seeing it in people in their 30s and 40s, a mental health crisis out of nowhere. They may need a COVID test because if they have no history of that, it can be from the brain effects of COVID. So it's just a really interesting, it's a perplexing virus. So and it is interesting looking at the three of us who, though we may have high stress, we are walking the walk. We all eat healthy and exercise regularly and practice mindfulness and take supplements. And none of us got to skate by with being symptom free. So I'm going to pass it on to Neil after saying that. I do feel like Dr. Woodward that after about 3 weeks, I was feeling good enough to see patients, and now I feel totally back to normal. So, I am going to say one other thing, Neil, before I pass it on. So as far as getting vaccinated after you've had the virus, there are recommendations to get vaccinated after the virus. If you've had monoclonal antibodies, you are supposed to wait 90 days. If you haven't, you can still wait 90 days because you're likely immune. I had some annual blood work done about 5 weeks after I tested positive for COVID, and we went ahead and looked at antibodies, and I did not have them. So I went ahead and got vaccinated. And I've had both shots, and I did fine. The first one I had a sore arm, the second one I had a sore arm, and some of that weird confusion like I had during COVID, I had that for 24 hours again. But I did want to do that in case there are patients that want to go ahead and do that. I wanted to have that experience so I could help them see what that's like. And I wanted to make sure I was protected since I didn't have antibodies yet. And it may have been that if I had waited a couple more weeks, my antibodies would have shown up, but we don't know. Not everybody gets antibodies after they get the virus. So now I'll pass it on to Dr. Carl.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody, for coming and being here tonight. And it's just fun for me, actually, to listen to the other doctors' stories. Mine was not dissimilar. You know, what is amazing, and I do want to thank everybody for reaching out to me when I wasn't feeling well. I can't even tell you how much I appreciated that. It meant so much. So thank you guys for that. You know, what's amazed me about this virus is how variable it is. I have a patient who comes to see me from New Jersey. He's in his 70s. He got COVID, tested, and he did get it. He tested positive twice, and then we tested him for antibodies 6 or 8 weeks later, and he had antibodies, and he had not symptom one. Didn't even know he had the virus. It was incredible. And then I'm going to tell my story in a minute. Mine was at least moderate. My symptoms were at least moderate. And then I was talking to Dr. Woodward a few weeks ago, and he was telling me a story about one of his friends who's a doctor down in Charlotte, whose nurse got it. And she was, I believe, 50 years old and died in 5 days and in excellent shape, and maybe even did triathlons. So it's just incredible to me how variable this virus is and how it affects all of us so differently. And we don't really know why yet. You know, it's such a novel virus. It's so new to us. You know, we're learning each week what this thing is all about and how to treat it and maybe how to protect ourselves from it. You know, there's some information about blood types, particularly the people who are of the O blood type, that due to a certain receptor that may protect them some. Other than that, we don't know why it's so variable and affects everybody so differently. You know, my story was, again, not dissimilar to Dr. Woodward's and Dr. Colfer's. I was taking a break. I was down in Florida, and I got down there Thursday after Christmas and felt great, actually. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, felt well. Sunday night, developed a little sore throat, a little cough. And I was with Mom, and I said, all right, well, you know, I certainly have the potential to get exposed. Let me go check. And again, similar to Dr. Kolf and Dr. Woodward, I went and did the rapid test on Monday and was negative. And trust me, the nurse who did the test, she got a good sample. She was up there pretty good. And so it wasn't that. And I tested negative. And so, you know, I said, okay, well, great, just a cold. I'm not going to worry about it. At that point, I didn't know what was going on in Richmond. I hadn't had a chance to talk to her. And I didn't know at that point that she wasn't feeling well and that her nurse was positive. And so I just said, okay, well, you know, it's just a cold. I'm in good shape. This thing, it's probably not going to get me. And so I went about my business. But by, you know, middle of the week, probably Wednesday, Thursday, I'm going, man, this is not just a cold. There's something wrong. I just don't feel well. I have no energy. I just feel like a punk. Matter of fact, my brother was down there. I was playing golf with my brother. We were on the third hole. Of course, I was kicking his butt. But by the time we got to the third hole, I said, you go ahead, man. I got to go back and get some rest. So I went back to the house and fell asleep and slept and slept and slept. I got up Friday morning, dragged myself out of bed, retested. Of course, at that point, I was positive. And really, for the next 10 days, it was just, it was unlike anything I've ever really had before. You know, again, like Dr. Woodward, it was just this fatigue that that I couldn't overcome. You know, and you know, people who know me, they know me as, you know, before I was a doctor, I was kind of this tennis guy. I mean, that's where I went to UNC, played tennis down Chapel Hill, and you know, so, I mean, went and played semi-pro, so I'm used to just going out there, being in the sun, playing for 4 hours. No big deal. just bring it on. Let's do it. I couldn't overcome this thing for anything. I mean, it just knocked me on my tail. And honestly, for 10 days, I just hardly could get out of bed. I would make myself get out of bed, made myself hydrate, made myself drink a little bit of soup or whatever I could get down, though I had very little appetite, and honestly lost about 12 pounds during this whole thing. Of course, I've gained it back and some since recovering, which probably isn't great. And so it was just absolutely no fun. There were a couple nights I felt like, God darn, if I feel any worse than this, I may have to go to the hospital. And that's hard for me to say and to even admit to that vulnerability. But I mean, I absolutely kind of felt that bad. I never got short of breath. I didn't lose taste or smell. I didn't develop significant chest pain, though I had this hollow feeling in my chest. And I just figured it was probably from the cough. So I wasn't panicked about it. And of course, I was checking my oxygen saturations and they were normal. So I felt relatively safe, but I just didn't feel well. The real issue was, and at the same time, similar to Dr. Woodward, Dr. Colfer, I started the Ivermectin, the antiparasitic she was talking about, that doesn't have any great data, though some of the studies do say that it may have some antiviral properties. And I figured, well, if I can stop the virus from replicating, why not? And I didn't, we didn't think it could hurt us in any way. So we felt it was worth trying. And we did the Quercetin and the melatonin and the baby aspirin and the vitamin D and the vitamin C and the omegas and all the things that actually were suggested by a protocol suggested by Eastern Virginia Medical School back in August that we've been following and asking our patients to do. So we felt like we were doing all the right things, and yet we all still got hit pretty good by this darn thing. So, so at that point, although I'm always a very sympathetic person, I believe, I developed great empathy for people who've had to go through this thing, going through it myself, and for other patients that I take care of, that have chronic fatigue syndrome, and the labs are normal. We don't quite know what to do. Going through it myself, I said, God darn. So this is what it feels like to every day not have that ability to get up and go. And so you do learn something when you go through it yourself. That's for sure. Probably the worst thing that happened, of course, was my mom got it. And mom's 81, 82 years old, and in good health. We take care of her here, and so she's in very good health and very active and plays golf, and she's very intelligent, continues to do real estate, and but at this age, of course, I'm very worried. And so I also got her on all the right supplements, started on the ivermectin, but also was able to get her what we call monoclonal antibodies. Dr. Colfer had alluded to it. And it's a way it's an infusion. It takes, about an hour. And people that have COVID and they're over 55 and they have one other medical comorbidity, such as anything could be hypertension or extra weight, they qualify for this. And so the day mom tested positive for COVID, somehow I got in the car and took her over to the infusion center. And I got one of our doctors down there to write the order, and she got the infusion. That, along with the ivermectin, starting her, really on day 1, day 2. I really think it allowed her to not allow this virus to replicate like it would have if we hadn't gotten her that therapy. I believe that. I don't know if it's 100% true, but I believe that because, and again, as Dr. Colfer said, she's an N of 1. These are case studies. These aren't double-blind placebo studies, but in my experience, this was something that really did help her. Interestingly enough, when I was at the infusion center, mom looked great and she was getting the infusion. The nurse looked at me and she said, "Sir, you look like hell. You should get this." And I said, "Can you give it to me?" She said, "Give me an order." And I ended up getting the monoclonal antibodies also, which, was good and bad, because at that point, I was on day 10 of symptoms. And honestly, if you're going to do it, you should do it probably, as early as possible. And I did get a little nausea from it. I guess I'm glad I did it. On the other hand, it did put me back from being able to get the vaccine. I have to wait 90 days, which is fine. And that's certainly something I will do. But yeah, I will tell you, again, it's very variable, and I've taken care of, younger people who get it for a day or two, and they say, it was no big deal. I've taken care of older people who get it, and it was similar to my story. I've taken care of, unfortunately, older people who or didn't take care of them, but was aware of people generally that have been older that didn't make it, unfortunately. And and so it's just one of those things, as John said earlier, the more we can do to keep our bodies stronger. If we happen to get something like this, I think the better off we are. We can fight it off a little bit easier. If we do happen to get it, and as Dr. Kulfer said, if you can let us know early, we do have some suggestions that might be helpful. And I guess the only the silver linings I can see from going through COVID in 2020, where we do know as a world we can develop a vaccine in 10 months, where it usually takes 5 or 6 years, which is incredible. And the other, I think learning point going through this kind of winter season, this is the first time in my career, probably in, over close to 25 years, where I've hardly seen any flu or any upper respiratory infections, whether it's bronchitis or sinusitis or strep. I mean, it's been so rare to see any of that in our clinic this year. And I've got to believe it's because we're taking better care of ourselves, whether it's with washing our hands more or doing some social distancing or wearing the mask. So I don't know what the new normal is going to be, but I have to believe that we are going to be a little bit more careful, in the future, just for the fact that, it's from what I'm saying just now, I'm not seeing any upper respiratory infections. Not that I want us wearing masks forever. Certainly none of us want to do that. But I think it is a good idea for us to think as we get through this and get to this new normal, that we continue to wash our hands and be a little bit more careful. And I think we're all happy to take any questions at this point.
All right. Thank you all for sharing your stories. I know that was super helpful for me and hopefully for others as well. We have a ton of questions, so I will just go ahead and get started with those. First one is, the main 2 vaccines we have are RNA-based. The Johnson & Johnson is from a live virus, more like how the flu shot works. What are the pluses and minuses of each for older patients?
Well, I'll start. We don't know the pluses or minuses yet on the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines because they're brand new. The technology, as you mentioned, is messenger RNA, and so how that works differently than the older vaccine, where we actually put the dead vaccine into somebody's body and we get an immune response. That's been great technology over the years. It's worked for a century, right? I mean, look what we've done with these vaccines with polio and measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox. That's the vaccine that we've used for the last 50, 60, 70 years, and it's worked well, for the most part, for sure, saved millions and millions of lives and throughout the world. This newer technology is probably here to stay. We don't. It's certainly easier to make. We don't have to grow it in an egg base or anything like that. We can synthesize it much easier. And what we mean by messenger RNA is we're giving the body, we're asking the body to synthesize or make through our own DNA this S spike or this S protein, just the little piece of protein that sits on the surface of the COVID virus. And we're getting an incredibly robust immune response just by making that little spike protein. So in my opinion, and of course we don't know this yet, I think that's going to be improved technology. Not having to put the entire virus into our body and just asking the body to code for a little piece of the virus. Time will tell, obviously. Short term, the side effects have been very, very few and limited, with, as I said, a very robust, about a 95% efficacy with the messenger RNA vaccine. The J&J vaccine, the problem with the messenger RNA vaccine, it is 2 shots. It's hard to distribute, it's hard to store, because we have to freeze it at certain temperatures. The J&J, as you said, is the older technology, which has worked well for a long, long time. It is 1 shot. The efficacy wasn't as good. I believe in the mid-60s, though the efficacy from what I read recently was as good in the mid-90s as far as not allowing people to get ill enough where they need to go to the hospital. So it was saving lives, but potentially the vaccine wasn't as good as far as limiting symptom relief as the two messenger RNA vaccines. And if Mary and John would like to add to that, please do.
Yeah, I would say that the Johnson & Johnson is not a live virus in the sense of it being the COVID-19 virus. It's an adenovirus that's been altered. And adenoviruses are cold viruses. They've put that little spike protein in there so that your immune system can react without putting the whole COVID-19 vaccine in there,
That's right.
I mean, virus in there. So just to kind of alleviate any worries of getting COVID from the vaccine. And that technology has been used before and may be able to be used, both of these technologies may be able to be used to treat other viruses that we haven't been able to vaccinate for in the past, like HIV, hepatitis C, Ebola. So this is exciting for the future of vaccination. So for saving even millions more lives. But I don't think we can say that one is better than the other for a certain population or for the overall population necessarily. And we're probably not going to have a lot of choice in it. If you're able to get vaccinated, you kind of have to take what they have. I mean, you can always refuse it and wait till you can get a vaccine later, but that could be a month later. You don't know. So it's kind of interesting. And I didn't mention when I was talking about Dr. Carl and I getting COVID, we were due to be vaccinated on about, I think, the 15th of January. So we just barely made it. So.
Yeah, I'd say a comment too is, one of the problems with the rollout of this vaccine was not only the distribution, but the manufacturing and then the storage of the deep freeze that was required for the Pfizer versus the Moderna. And the second shot became a compliance issue for a lot of people, especially after, I'm somewhat protected, maybe I won't show up for that second vaccination. So there is that hope with the Johnson & Johnson, I believe, for better, wider distribution with less logistics involved to actually get it out there. But it sounds like that, whatever is most available to you is what's recommended currently, so you don't delay the vaccination and developing the immunity. So kind of an interesting idea. But the other thing that I think is great about the current study of this is, there's been 7 phase 3 trials in these vaccines, and they're already developing modifications to that S protein spike for the mutant strains. And so those are already underway. And some of this is interesting because of the big mutant strains, the vaccines have been distributed in those areas of the world, like South Africa with the Johnson & Johnson and with the New York mutant strains. And so we're seeing how well they're doing against all these different areas of the country or the world, to see how effective they're going to be. And so far, the death rate by giving a vaccine is 0 on all of them. So everyone who's received a vaccine has not died from COVID-19. That is amazing in terms of that kind of data. And so in terms of serious illness and in terms of the lethality of the virus, these vaccines have become life-saving so far, with, like Dr. Carl and Mary have said, that significant amount of data poured into this, and the human experiment has turned into a beautiful scientific project so far. But it's proving to be very safe and effective, just like the trials after, I don't know how many millions have been vaccinated at this point, but significant amounts. So we're really flattening this curve out pretty nicely, and hopefully these mutant strains don't kick in. But it looks like that even those in right, 28% New York, I think, is the latest that 28% of the new cases are the mutant strain in New York, and up to 50% in South Africa is the mutant strain, and it's working against those so far. So even those that are fearful of that there's some good news here, and so far very safe news too.
All right, thank you. Next question is about supplements. All of the treatment supplements you were taking for COVID are probably ones you already take regularly, correct? Did you increase your usual daily dose or do anything different than you normally do supplement-wise?
Yeah, I'll jump on that one first. Yes, I did. There was an increased recommendation. I do take a number of them, of the supplements that we had in our newsletter, such as the zinc. I'll just start with zinc. I don't take zinc every day normally. I take it a few days a week. I do increase my zinc during the cold and flu season typically. Or when I'm around, if I decide to do a shift in an ER or we have a higher volume of sick patients, I may increase my zinc around that time. However, during this time and when I did have COVID, I did increase my zinc. Most days it was 50 milligrams, I'll be honest. I did not have an appetite either. Even supplements were not appealing at that time. The recommendations on the dose was varied, but usually at least 50 milligrams up to 100 milligrams was kind of a standard variance of recommendation for that dose. I did caution people. I do think we need to be careful to stay on these high doses for prolonged periods. With zinc, you can actually create a relative copper deficiency with too much zinc ongoing for too long, and we need copper for our bone marrow to create our white blood cells to fight infections. So I think that's just another little caveat that doses are during either a treatment phase of a virus or a preventive phase, and then we can potentially taper that off or take some pill holidays off, to give us a rest from those larger doses. Vitamin C, I know there was lots of dose ranges for that. I took a fairly modest dose, 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day. A lot of people would recommend up to 5 grams a day. Some of that is GI tolerance also, how well you tolerate that vitamin C. If it's a buffered vitamin C, you tolerate it a little bit better. Vitamin D, I didn't change my vitamin D levels. I already take a larger dose of vitamin D, so I didn't feel the need to do that. Glutathione is one that a lot of people may not be aware of. Some people are. Glutathione is a very powerful antioxidant, and like Mary suggested, does cross the blood-brain barrier and help with some of the brain fog that people had. I certainly had some of it. Some of these post-COVID syndrome patients are having this prolonged decreased mentation and processing that I would be suggesting glutathione for those folks as well. And then some of the anti-inflammatories, resveratrol or omega-3s, I think are a great idea. So vitamin A, I did have some vitamin A drops in addition to my multivitamin that I did take some extra dosing. So my multivitamin is a pretty strong one. I think you guys have Phyto Multi. So it's one of my favorite multivitamins, Phyto Multi, which already has 10,000 units of vitamin A. And I did take another 10,000 for a period of time. Vitamin A really concentrates in the respiratory mucosal part of your anatomy. So it definitely plays a role in signaling of the immune system. And so vitamin D and vitamin A are critical for that kind of communication and coordination of our immune function. So those were my big heavy hitters. So I'll pass that on. But I think I did increase my dose, but I am on most of those, not every day in a normal non-COVID environment.
I feel very similar to Dr. Woodward on that. I don't always take zinc, and I made sure I was getting that every day. The vitamin A is interesting because cod liver oil is a good source of vitamin A. And so some of you may have those grandmothers that made you take a teaspoon of cod liver oil when you didn't feel well. And turns out they might have been onto something. And for my patients that take cod liver oil regularly, I will follow vitamin A levels in the blood because, like vitamin D, it's a fat soluble vitamin and you can overdo it. Another good reason, like the zinc, to not just stay on those high doses all the time, but to to just do it when you need that extra boost. So.
And again, I was very similar to both Dr. Woodward and Dr. Colfer. I did add something I don't usually take called Quercetin, which potentially has some antiviral effects. And I also added melatonin, which was recommended that I sleep relatively well, so I don't generally take that. And lastly, I added a baby aspirin, as Mary mentioned earlier. What we have found with COVID, it's a multi-organ disease, really. I mean, when it first came out, we're saying, "Oh, this is just a respiratory virus." Well, it hadn't played out that way. As we're talking about tonight, it affects the heart, it affects the kidneys, it affects the brain, it affects the vasculature. So I did end up starting a baby aspirin, which I think was probably helpful.
And I would say there is some caution there's a lot of recommendations out there on nutrients, and I would definitely run it by us or your provider or clinician that's guiding you through that, because there are, like the vitamin A, for instance, I've seen 200,000 units recommended ongoingly for weeks, very high doses. It can cause what we call hepatotoxicity and a real strain on your liver. And so I think this mega dosing you should be cautious with it. And if used for a very short period of time, probably.
I have a supplement question specifically for Dr. Colfer. What benefit does quercetin have for immune response? Personally, I take it for mast cell issues.
And I think Dr. Carl touched on this, that it has that anti-inflammatory, and that term can be misconstrued. So Dr. Carl always points this out. We want the immune system to be balanced. It's not really, anti-inflammatory. We mean we don't want bad inflammation, but we also don't want to suppress the immune system. So quercetin really is balancing. So it can be helpful when you're worried about an overreaction of the immune system like we see with COVID-19, but also in possibly some autoimmune conditions. And I do think it has some mast cell stabilization, which we can see with certain supplements, other supplements as well. So hopefully that helps answer that question.
Okay, I have a non-supplement question. I purchased an oximeter. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
At what level should anyone be worried?
Well, certainly we should be worried anything below 92%. Pulse oximeter measures our oxygen saturation in our blood, and we can do it through the fingertips. And generally, most people's O2 sats are in the mid 90s, 95 to 98, 99%. And so we do get worried if people start to drop into the low 90s, particularly if they have other COVID symptoms, and also if they're developing some shortness of breath. That's actually considered that's probably the main reason to consider going to the emergency room, honestly enough, if your O2 sats drop and you're short of breath, because at that point the virus has moved from kind of the upper respiratory area down into the lungs of the lower respiratory area. And we certainly are concerned about pneumonia at that point. So I would say, and the other docs can weigh in on this, but if it gets into the low 90s with other symptoms, or below 90 without any other symptoms, that's probably one of the main reasons to certainly call us and even consider going to the hospital at that point.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's interesting. My husband is an ER doctor, and I'm sure Dr. Woodward has seen this in the ER. And surprisingly, he said sometimes people look pretty good. They're sitting there and you put the pulse ox on and they're satting 88% and they're healthy. And it can be surprising. So I do think, obviously, if you're feeling short of breath or chest pain and you're having a low oxygen saturation, it's important. But if you get COVID, you should get an oximeter, and you may want to get it now so you have it if you do get it. And then because you can feel not terrible and have a pretty low oxygen saturation with this virus. And that's a red flag that you need to be seen in the hospital.
Yeah, particularly because you're probably sitting and laying around much because you don't have a lot of energy and you don't even realize. But if you went out and tried to, run a mile, forget it. So it's surprising, but it's probably the number one thing that we look at as far as sending people to the hospital quicker rather than later, for sure.
Yeah, I would comment just to say that, they call these people the happy hypoxics, in the ER, that they look relatively not in a whole lot of distress, but they had COVID symptoms, so they showed up, or they had an exposure and they coughed, Mary knows this, coughed twice, and then ended up in the ER. So very interestingly, because of what Dr. Carl was talking about with the increase of clotting and the vascular system involved with this, that you can have a pulmonary embolism and not have a lot of coughing and have this shortness of breath that can drop your oxygen saturations. So I do correlate the symptoms as well, symptomatic and the pulse oximeter, and to correlate them. So if I'm significantly short of breath and my pulse ox has dropped from 98 to 93 in the last 45 minutes, and my respiratory status is worsening and I'm struggling a little bit more, then it might be time to head in before you watch it too much further. Or if, another case would be somebody who has a significant intrinsic lung disease like asthma or COPD, and they're already on oxygen to keep them at 93%, and then it drops to 90 or 91. That would be a clear sign to go in sooner with little reserve of lung volume or lung capacity there. So.
Okay, I have two questions about hydroxychloroquine. One is, what is your stance on it? And then the other is, hydroxychloroquine has now been approved by the AMA for early treatment of COVID symptoms, along with a couple of other medications. Do you use this with patients with early symptoms that show up at home?
Well, I haven't used it yet. We certainly studied it several months ago. I'm going to let the other doctors talk because maybe they have. I don't think Mary has, but maybe John has. When we looked into it a few months ago, it was just anecdotal evidence, and we didn't see where it had proven itself out in any studies. So I personally haven't used it at this point. I mean, I'm not saying that it's dissimilar to ivermectin in some sense, which are both kind of anti-malarial drugs. I just haven't seen the data at this point. So I personally haven't used it. So I'll let the other docs talk about it.
Yeah, it looks like in the last few weeks there is more data supporting it, and the only thing that I have a little bit of a ethical dilemma with, I don't want to overprescribe hydroxychloroquine and then people with lupus can't get it. So that's, ivermectin is different. We don't have a lot of parasites in the US. It's mostly used in farm animals. It's doesn't have a lot of side effects. And so I feel like it's low harm and it's not harming anybody else for me to prescribe it. I'm open to the hydroxychloroquine, but I just want to make sure it's not making it so that there's a shortage for people that if they don't have it, they can get into real medical trouble with the systemic lupus.
Yeah, my stance on it initially was I prescribed it a few times, probably more than a handful of times, 5 to 10 times probably. Some of those folks were just very, very afraid and very scared, and they were exposed. And there were a couple protocols that were out there. One was a prophylactic dose protocol where you take 1 tablet a week of a certain dose. And they have a similar protocol like that for ivermectin. And so this whole idea of you may be around a high exposure, or you may have an illness and you want to add any antiviral potential that has. When I prescribed it, it was before it was approved. It was really off-label, and I don't know if I could tell you that I had these success stories with it because I don't have those. The data became very conflicting after a while. Initially, there was some positive data, and then there was some conflicting data. most of the data that was conflicting was for the sick hospital patients and not for the outpatients and preventive folks. And now that that data is out there, I feel better about that I prescribed it, as long as it didn't take it out of the hands of a lupus patient like my wife, you know? So she actually used to be on Plaquenil. So what I took when I, you know, initially I couldn't get Ivermectin and she actually had some old Plaquenil in the house. She doesn't take it anymore, but so I took a little bit of that. I don't know if it helped, honestly. But I think that the data is better for this preventive or early onset of disease. But I agree, if there's going to be mass prescriptions and it's going to take it out of the hands of people that need it just based on fear, maybe it's not such a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't studied it in a while. When I was first looking into it months and months ago, I think the mechanism of action, it was sitting on the A2 receptor, which wouldn't allow the virus to enter the body. So they were looking at it as to try not to allow the virus to enter and replicate. But they just, the data just didn't prove itself out. But maybe something's come along, like Mary said, over the last week or two that I'm just not familiar with. But it's neat that you tried it on yourself and some other folks, but in your kind of, just the small little clinical experience you've had, you can't say one way or the other whether it was helpful or not.
Yeah, I really can't. I will say that I did have a case of ivermectin that this gentleman, his saturations were dropping.
Yeah.
It was a 49-year-old gentleman who's fairly good health and
Right.
Really had significant symptoms and a pretty significant cough with shortness of breath. He and his wife both had it at home. And I initially offered the ivermectin when he was starting to take a turn and wasn't feeling well. And he wanted to wait. And so we waited. And then he called me a couple days later and said, I think I'm willing to try it now. My oxygen's down to 91%.
Jeez,
And
yeah.
so, and I said, well, let's, play it safe here. If you need to go to the ER for further evaluation, then that's what you need to do. But he was within 3 days, he felt like $1 million. And I don't know about $1 million, maybe $1,000, but
Yeah.
He literally called me. He said, what is the deal with this? Everyone needs to know about this thing. This was amazing for my wife and I. And so, that being said, I don't know if he was just at that phase where he was going to get better anyway,
Sure.
but
Sure.
he certainly believes it helped him. And I think there's enough data to suggest maybe it did.
Yeah, when Dr. Colfer and I were talking through it, we both decided that it was worth doing. We didn't feel like we could hurt ourselves. We could only help. And, as both of you guys mentioned, we didn't want to flood the market with people getting prescriptions for hydroxychloroquine, when, we do know that there's patients with lupus and RA and other people that need the Plaquenil, and that would have kind of been a bit of a disaster. That would not have been the right thing to do, particularly if we didn't have the data we were, looking for. So, as we talked about early on, we're still learning a lot about this virus. It's so novel and so new to the human species. I guess hopefully we'll know more, as we learn better treatment strategies and preventive strategies over the next year or so.
Yeah.
So in the interest of time, we are close or at time, but I do have a couple of questions about vaccine effectiveness that I'm hoping I can kind of combine. And then if there are any questions that we weren't able to get to, you can always send us an email at info@welcomemd.com and we can respond to you there. But with the vaccine effectiveness, so bear with me because again, it's going to be me kind of combining these questions, but as COVID continues to mutate, will additional vaccines come out that people will need to get, even though they have already been fully vaccinated for COVID? And if that's the case, how long before we will need to be vaccinated again? And can we use a different manufacturer for the second time we're vaccinated?
Yeah, I think that's $1 million question that nobody really knows the answer to because we aren't there yet. And so far, like Dr. Woodward said, the vaccines that we have seem to be preventing death, even with the variants, which is critical. Ideally, we would get enough people vaccinated that we would start to see enough decline in viral spread that we aren't going to get into multiple variants. But it is possible that will happen. And I do think it's possible that we may have to get some kind of booster. It'll be really interesting to see if they say if you have, I do think it would make sense that if you had messenger RNA, that your booster may be that type of vaccine, but I don't know that it would exclude you from getting a different type of vaccine later if they're looking at a different protein altogether to vaccinate you for. We get flu shots annually, and you don't have to get the same manufacturer. So it's the same technology though. So
Yeah.
it's, I don't know.
Yeah.
Great.
I agree with Dr. Colfer. Yeah, there may be some booster shots that are going to be needed, but our hope is, even as these we develop these variants, they seem like they may be as infectious or more infectious, but certainly not more deadly. And our hope is, like with other like with other viruses, that this virus, as it mutates, will actually mutate to a weaker strain, where it turns into more of a cold virus. And that would make sense, right? Because dumb viruses are viruses that are so powerful they kill the host, they kill the human. But then the virus doesn't survive. And so we're hoping, we're hopeful, we don't know this yet, that this virus, if it does mutate, and it does continue to mutate, that it will mutate weaker, where we all survive, so it survives. But in the meantime, I agree with these. There are going to be some variants, and there probably are going to be some booster shots. And, and nobody knows how long, once we develop antibodies, how long they're going to last. We just don't know that yet. We've all had the, we've all had the virus. Dr. Colfer, when she checked for antibodies, she didn't have them after what, 4 weeks, 6 weeks? When did you check me?
It was almost 5 weeks.
Almost 5 weeks. So 5 to 6 weeks, we should develop some antibodies. That's what we generally do. We develop, kind of these T memory cell type of antibodies, which will allow us, if we get exposed to it again, to be able to fight it off more quickly. But we don't know how long the natural immunities last. And at this point, we don't really know how long, once we get the vaccine, how long those antibodies last. Again, it's just that new. John, any comments? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I don't have a good answer other than, there's some studies showing antibodies eight months later. There are some studies, and that's after natural infection, which, of the confirmed cases in this country, I'm not even sure what the latest is. But the prediction is you triple or quadruple that number as to the amount that have really been infected, that may have been exposed and can develop some immunity. So you have this 100+ million people have been immunized by just natural infection. And now you're adding, I don't know, 50 million people, another 39 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson going to be distributed soon. So we're going to have a pretty large number of immune folks out there. We just don't know. There's a study in Iceland that showed 50% or 90% of those that were positive had antibodies and immune cells 4 months later. Right now they're playing it pretty cautious by saying 3 months after a vaccine or after you've been sick is what you can count on. I think those are pretty conservative. I don't know. I'm hopeful that, I even wonder if there's a kind of a wax and wane of the antibody load, that maybe it will surface again with a small reinoculation of a particle or something. I think there's so much unknown, and it's the ongoing science project and observing this on a scientific, educated manner that we'll be able to inform people better. The good news is they're really pouring their time and effort and resources in studying it, and the whole world is, which is fantastic. So.
Yep.
I just had another question come through. I'm going to ask one more about the vaccine, and then we'll cut it off. But and this is one that I think a lot of people have heard. Does taking a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug after the vaccine lessen the immune response?
Mary, you want to take that one?
I'll take it. Yeah. So probably not. I don't know that we have good studies on that. So there was a popular trend a few years back of pre-medicating pediatric patients with Tylenol or ibuprofen before vaccination, and they've stopped recommending that because they did see less response. So I think it's pretty clear that you don't want to pre-medicate before your shot. But And I'm telling people to take Tylenol if they develop sore arm, fever. Usually that's all you need after a vaccine. If you're having body aches, headache, fever, or any kind of symptoms post-vaccine. There's some weird data on COVID and ibuprofen. Of course, getting a vaccine is different. If you're just talking about science, it's probably totally fine to take ibuprofen after your vaccine. If Tylenol is going to help you just as much, that may be a better choice, in my opinion. But it's an opinion; it's not fact. So we don't really know. So
I agree. Yes. So we're asking our patients not to pre-medicate and to not post-medicate unless they develop symptoms that are bothersome enough where they feel like they need to. And we don't feel like, and I haven't seen the data that says it's going to decrease their immune response, but certainly give yourself the best chance. And if it's just mild symptoms, let it run its course. That's what we're telling our patients at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I think a fever response is typically a reassuring good response. It tells you that your immune system's being activated appropriately from the vaccine. And I think the old recommendations, I don't know if you guys do that, go ahead and let the fever climb. It's creating an environment that's not favorable for the virus to survive. And so take the Tylenol if you're just that uncomfortable, so that's kind of an old recommendation, but I think it still holds true. Do you guys recommend that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone on the line for joining us tonight. As I said before, if we weren't able to get to, I think we got to most of your questions. I think I was able to combine some. There were a lot on the same topics. But if there's anything outstanding that you're wondering about, you can always email us. Or if you have questions about the webinar in general, you can email us at info@wellcomemd.com. Don't forget that's with 2 L's. All right, well, thank you, Dr. Carl, Dr. Colfer, Dr. Woodward. I'm glad that you guys are all healthy and back to 100%. And thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Jamie, thanks for hosting it. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We really appreciate it. And any further questions, just let us know. We'll answer them as best we can.
Yeah. Thanks. Be safe, everyone.